Hey there, welcome to Malcolm's Anatomy. As some of you already know, my name is Malcolm, and in this video, an associate of mine will be taking you through a historic yet interesting journey, the life account of Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, for those of you who haven't subscribed to this channel, please support us and help us grow by doing so. Leave your reactions, and in the comment section, let us know what you think about this video. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to business. In 19th century Europe, many women died of a disease commonly known as childbed fever. The disease became a scourge that had death rates of up to 30%. Now, various theories as to the cause of the disease had been proposed, yet no one had been able to solve the mystery. So, troubled by that spectacle of numerous mothers dying a slow, agonizing death, a physician known as Ignaz Semmelweis became determined to root out the cause of that disease and solve the problem. Although microorganisms had been observed under the microscope as early as 1674, the potential dangers of these microorganisms had not been fully understood then. As a result, it was common practice for doctors to carry out child deliveries right after carrying out autopsies or coming in contact with corpses without first sterilizing or washing their hands. Ignaz Semmelweis introduced hand washing into medical practice, thus saving countless lives. His discovery in later years earned him the title, the Savior of Mothers. So the question is, what is his story? How was he able to cope with the challenges that childbed fever presented then? How was he able to discern the connection between what he termed invisible cadaveric particles and childbed fever? What oppositions did he face? Well, these questions and more will be answered as you follow through the life course of Ignaz Semmelweis, as narrated by the first winner of our voice-over audition, Kevwe.
The name Ignaz Semmelweis may not be a household name, yet his work has benefited most modern families. Born in Buda, now Budapest, Hungary, he received his medical degree at the University of Vienna in 1844. On taking up his post as assistant to a professor at the first maternity clinic of Vienna's General Hospital in 1846, Semmelweis faced an appalling reality. More than 13% of the women giving birth there died from a disease called childbed fever. So, what did he do to change the tide of the scourge in favor of the doctors? Well, let's move a little backwards in time to when his journey began. Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis was born on 1st of July 1818 in the Taban neighborhood of Buda, today part of Budapest, Kingdom of Hungary, in the then Austrian Empire. He was the fifth child out of 10 of the prosperous grocer family of Józef Semmelweis and Therese Müller. He began studying law at the University of Vienna in the autumn of 1837. But by the following year, for reasons that are no longer known, he had switched to medicine. He was awarded his Doctor of Medicine degree in 1844. Later, after failing to obtain an appointment in a clinic for internal medicine, Semmelweis decided to specialize in obstetrics. Some of his notable teachers included Karl von Rokitansky, Joseph Koda, and Ferdinand von Hebra. On July 1st, 1846, he was appointed assistant to Professor Johann Klein in the first obstetrical clinic of the Vienna General Hospital. Today, in a United States hospital, a comparable position would be chief resident. His duties were to examine patients each morning in preparation for the professor's rounds, to supervise difficult deliveries, to teach students of obstetrics, and be clerk of records. But something was out of place in that hospital. There were 2 maternity clinics at the Vienna General Hospital. The first clinic had an average maternal mortality or death rate of about 10% due to the puerperal fever, commonly known as the childbed fever. The second clinic's mortality or death rate was considerably lower, averaging less than 4%. This meant that more mothers die in the first clinic than they do in the second clinic. If you were to be a pregnant woman and you lived in Europe during the 19th century, how would knowing this affect your choice with regards to the clinic to be admitted to? Well, because this fact was known outside the hospital, women begged to be admitted to the second clinic due to the bad reputation of the first. In his life's work titled The Etiology, Concept and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, published in 1861, Semmelweis described desperate women begging on their knees not to be admitted to the first clinic. Some women even preferred to give birth in the streets, pretending to have given sudden birth en route to the hospital, a practice later known as street births. Now he observed and was puzzled that childbed fever was rare among women who gave birth in the streets. He became severely troubled that his first clinic had a much higher mortality rate due to the fever than the second clinic. It made him so miserable that life seemed worthless to him. The 2 clinics used almost the same techniques, and Semmelweis started eliminating all possible differences, including even religious practices. He excluded overcrowding as a cause, since the second clinic was always more crowded and yet the mortality was lower. He eliminated climate as a cause because the climate was the same. Now, the only major difference left was the individuals who worked in both clinics. So, who were the individuals who worked in the 2 clinics? The first clinic was the teaching service for medical students, while the second clinic had been selected in 1841 for the instruction of midwives only. In 1847, Semmelweis' breakthrough occurred. He was presented with a crucial clue. While performing a post-mortem examination, his good friend Jakob Koleschka was accidentally poked with a student scalpel. This subsequently led to his death. Now, Koleschka's own autopsy showed a pathology similar to that of the women who were dying from childbed fever. Semmelweis immediately proposed a connection between cadaveric contamination and childbed fever. He thought that perhaps what he termed poisons from cadavers or corpses were infecting pregnant patients thus causing childbed fever. He proposed that he, other doctors, and the medical students carried cadaverous particles on their hands from the autopsy room to the patient they examined in the first clinic. This explained why the student midwives in the second clinic, who were not engaged in autopsies and had no contact with corpses, saw a much lower mortality rate. Although basic forms of the germ theory, which suggests that minute organisms cause infection, had been proposed by Girolamo Fracastoro in 1546 and expanded upon by Marcus von Plensis in 1762. Such views were held in disdain in Europe then, where Galen's miasma theory remained dominant among scientists and doctors. So, for the sake of clarity, what was the miasma theory all about? Well, it was a medical theory that held that diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, or the Black Death were caused by a miasma, that is, a noxious form of bad air, also known as ninth air. The theory held that epidemics were caused by a bad air emanating from rotting or decaying organic matter. The theory was eventually abandoned by scientists and physicians after 1880 and replaced by the germ theory of disease, which postulates that specific germs, not miasma, caused specific diseases. The germ theory of disease had not yet been accepted in Vienna. Thus, Semmelweis instituted a policy of using a solution of chlorinated lime, otherwise known as calcium hypochlorite, for washing hands between autopsy work and the examination of patients. With what result? The mortality rate in the first clinic declined 90% and was then comparable to that in the second clinic. The mortality rate in April of 1847 was 18.3%. After hand washing was instituted in mid-May, the rates of that same year in June were 2.2%, July 1.2%, August 1.9%. And for the first time since the introduction of anatomical orientation, the death rate was 0 in 2 months in the year following this discovery. Yes, he had done it. He had finally gotten the solution to a profound medical problem. A hero he has become. Well, that wasn't entirely the case. Remember, there already were established scientific and medical opinions at the time, and Ignaz Semmelweis' discovery stood in stark contrast to those opinions. In addition, Semmelweis' results lacked scientific explanation at the time. That became possible only in the 1860s and 1870s, when Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and others further developed the germ theory of disease. Sadly, some doctors, for instance, were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands, feeling that their social status as gentlemen was insulted with the idea that their hands could be unclean. Toward the end of 1847, accounts of the work of Semmelweis began to spread around Europe. Semmelweis and his students wrote letters to the directors of several prominent maternity clinics, describing their recent observations. Ferdinand von Hebra, the editor of a leading Austrian medical journal, announced Semmelweis' discovery in the December 1847 and April 1848 issues of the medical journal. Hebra claimed that Semmelweis' work had a practical significance comparable to that of Edward Jenner's introduction of cowpox inoculations to prevent smallpox. As accounts of the dramatic reduction in mortality rates in Vienna were being circulated throughout Europe, Semmelweis had a good reason to expect that the chlorine washings would be widely adopted, saving tens of thousands of lives. However, some physicians, such as James Young Simpson, misinterpreted his claims and tried to belittle the significance of his discovery by arguing that he, Semmelweis, had said nothing new. For instance, they saw no difference between Semmelweis's groundbreaking findings and the idea presented in an 1843 paper by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. that childbed fever could pass from infected persons to others. This misunderstanding and others like it occurred partly because Semmelweis's work was known only through second-hand reports written by his colleagues and students. At this crucial stage, Semmelweis himself had published nothing. These and similar misinterpretations continued to cloud discussions of his work throughout the century. Some accounts emphasize that Semmelweis refused to communicate his method officially to the learned circles of Vienna, nor was he eager to explain it on paper. As a result, his ideas were rejected by the medical community. Nevertheless, he kept pressing. During 1848, Semmelweis widened the scope of his washing protocol to include all instruments coming in contact with patients in labor and used mortality rate time series to document his success in virtually eliminating childbed fever from the hospital ward. That same year, a series of tumultuous revolutions swept across Europe. It was a political turmoil that would affect Semmelweis's career. The Hungarian Revolution of 1848 that led to a war between the Austrian Empire and Hungary brought about a rift between Ignaz Semmelweis, who was Hungarian-born, and his superior, Johann Klein, who was a conservative Austrian. Although no evidence indicates that Semmelweis was personally involved in the Revolution of 1848, Johann Klein probably began to mistrust Semmelweis. So, by means of his influence, Semmelweis was obligated to leave the Vienna hospital when his term expired on March 20th, 1849. But still eager to press on, regardless of the opposition he faced, the day his term expired, Semmelweis wrote a petition to the Viennese authorities requesting to be made a private lecturer of obstetrics. At first, because of Klein's opposition, Semmelweis's petition was denied. But he reapplied and had to wait more than 18 months before finally being appointed as docent of theoretical obstetrics. Although the terms he was presented with denied him access to cadavers and limited him to teaching students by using leather-fabricated mannequins only. A few days after being notified of his appointment, Semmelweis left Vienna abruptly and returned to Pest. He left without saying goodbye to his former friends and colleagues, a move that might have offended them. According to his own account, though, he left Vienna because he was unable to endure further frustrations in dealing with the Viennese medical establishment. On 20th of May 1851, Semmelweis took a relatively insignificant, unpaid and honorary head physician position of the obstetric ward of St. Roch Hospital in Budapest. He held that position for 6 years, that is, until June 1857. Childbed fever was rampant at the clinic, but after taking over in 1851, Semmelweis virtually eliminated the disease. During 1851 to 1855, only 8 patients died from childbed fever, that is out of 933 deaths, estimated to be 0.85%. But just as it was the case in Vienna, despite the impressive results, Semmelweis' ideas were not still accepted by the other obstetricians in Budapest. The professor of obstetrics at the University of Pest, Ed Florian Berli, never adopted Semmelweis' methods. He continued to believe that childbed fever was due to uncleanliness of the bowel. Therefore, extensive purging was the preferred treatment. Following the death of Berli in 1854, Semmelweis was eventually appointed professor of obstetrics in 1855. Now, as professor of obstetrics, Semmelweis instituted chlorine washings at the University of Pest Maternity Clinic. Once again, the results were impressive. Beginning in 1861, Semmelweis suffered from severe depression and became absent-minded. He turned every conversation to the topic of childbed fever. After a number of unfavorable foreign reviews of his 1861 book, Semmelweis got badly upset. With the use of abusive open letters, he lashed out against his critics. These letters were addressed to various prominent European obstetricians, including Spatz, Scanzoni, Siebold, and to all obstetricians. The letters were full of bitterness, desperation, and fury, and were superlatively offensive, at times denouncing his critics as irresponsible murderers or ignoramuses. In mid-1865, his public behavior became exasperating and embarrassing to his associates. He started drinking immoderately. He spent progressively more time away from his family, sometimes in the company of a prostitute. In 1865, Janos Balasha wrote a document referring Semmelweis to a mental institution. On 30th July, Ferdinand Ritter von Hebra lured him, under the pretense of visiting one of Hebra's new institutes, to a Viennese insane asylum located in Lazareth-Gash. While he was there, Semmelweis figured out what was happening and tried to leave, but he was seized and severely beaten by several guards, secured in a straitjacket, and confined to a darkened cell. Apart from the straitjacket, treatment at the mental institution included dousing with cold water and administering castor oil, a laxative. Sadly, he died after 2 weeks, on August 13, 1865, at age 47, from a gangrenous wound due to the infection in his right hand, which might have been caused by the struggle, although his autopsy gave the cause of death as blood poisoning. He was buried in Vienna on 15th August 1865. Only a few people attended the funeral. Brief and insignificant announcements of his death appeared in a few medical periodicals in Vienna and Budapest. Although the rules of the Hungarian Association of Physicians and Natural Scientists specified in the preceding year that a commemorative address be delivered in honor of a member who had died, there was no address for Semmelweis. His death was never even mentioned. Janos Discher was appointed Semmelweis' successor at the Pest University Maternity Clinic. Immediately, mortality rates increased sixfold to 6%. But the physicians of Budapest said nothing. There were no inquiries, and there were no protests. Almost no one, either in Vienna or in Budapest, seemed to have been willing to acknowledge Semmelweis' life and work. His remains were transferred to Budapest in 1891. On 11th October 1964, they were transferred once more to the house in which he was born. The house is now a historical museum and library. honoring Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. Although his discovery was ridiculed by many during his lifetime, his advice on chlorine washings was probably more influential than he realized. Many doctors, particularly in Germany, appeared quite willing to experiment with the practical hand-washing measures that he proposed. For instance, a professor at a maternity institution in Kiel, Gustav Adolf Michaelis, was one of the first obstetricians to adopt the practice of compulsory chlorine hand washing. But eventually he committed suicide, feeling responsible for the death of his own cousin, whom he had earlier examined without washing his hands after she gave birth. Following the establishment of the germ theory, the importance of the work of Ignaz Semmelweis became undisputable, and his cause revered by subsequent physicians. Several structures and activities have been put in place in honor of him, one of which is the Ignaz Semmelweis Prize, considered the most prestigious Hungarian medical award. To most of his contemporaries, he died a madman. But today, many could conclude that he was in a sense one of the few sane men during his time.